and we're happy to debate the merits of our views. If you've got disagreements or agreements or queries or questions, use the Q&A function over the next 30 minutes, and we'll try and respond to some, if not all of them. But to kick us off, we're going to start with a map. We do like a map at the Centre for Cities, and we're going to have a map of what we think English devolution should look like when we get to the other side of the white paper. So if we can have the map, please. There it is. And Ant's going to just take a few moments just to run through the basics of what the map is, and then we'll get into what some of the responses have been and what our responses are to what some of the responses have been. So, Ant, kick us off. Describe to us what we're looking at when we look at this screen.
Yeah, sure thing, Andrew. So this is our proposal in our latest briefing, Economy First, a map for English devolution. And you can see that it's a map of England with two different colours on the map, green and kind of purpley colour. The purple colour areas are essentially mayoral combined authorities. So they're places with metro mayors with boroughs underneath them. And our vision is that the mayors would deliver strategic economic services, the powers of a combined authority, while boroughs continue delivering social services, personal services to the wider community. Outside of those purple areas, you can see there's also green areas. We argue that these areas should be unitary county council areas. So essentially having all the powers of a combined authority and a local authority rolled into one. And there's two principles behind this map, really. So the first is that, as the name gives away, this is all based around local economic geography. It's all kind of based on the principle that this is better for local economic governance than the current very complicated structure. And the definition of local economy that we've used is the high-skilled travel to work area. So essentially the commuting area of graduates in each local economy. But alongside that, the second principle is that this proposal is pragmatic. So we've not gone and we've not redrawn the boundaries. We haven't got out the crayons and done that in the vast majority of England on the map. Instead, we're using district councils as the building blocks for new authorities, either unitary shires or indeed the metropolitan two-tier structures there in purple.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. So we like a map for a bunch of reasons, but not least because ultimately when you have to put it down, you have to make some decisions and you have to be clear about the decisions and the principles that are guiding you to come to that. And it allows you to get beyond sort of generalizations about what you would ideally want to see in the abstract. So that's the map, and Ant's laid out some of the principles. If we can we'll withdraw the map for now. So if we can take the map down, thank you very much. And then if we need to put it back up, we will. Paul, as I said, plenty of debate in general about devolution and the shape of it. Fair bit of debate already and responses to our map and our view of what devolution should be. Just run through what some of those that we've heard already, the criticisms and challenges to our view, and then we'll have a bit of a think about and respond how we already think about the responses or our responses. So, Paul, over to you.
Yeah. So the first thing to say is that this thing is not easy. You're trying to redraw boundaries that people have attachments to. Clearly, there's a challenge there to do that, but it doesn't mean that we should duck it. But a number of things I think have come up that people have that have put in place are worth discussing because they have merit. We just think that having a framework around these things is helpful to try and cut through some of that. So one of the things that is thrown up is the fairly fuzzy, I would say, idea of civic identity and history being really important for this. And if we change these boundaries, then you're affecting somebody's civic identity because their small district councils become part of a larger council. Or you can't go and cut through Hampshire, let's say, as being one of the most controversial ones, because there's centuries of history of Hampshire haven't been in place, and doing that is cutting through that civic identity. I mean, there are two, I think, challenges to that. I think first is, do people really associate their civic identity with their local council? I'm sceptical about that. I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that might well be the case, so we need some evidence behind that. I think the second element around history is like, yes, history is important and something for us to recognise, but a boundary that was created in another age to represent the economy when it was totally different the way that it is now isn't really that helpful for the economy today, for the people who live and work in those economies today. And that's really what we have to think about. Doesn't mean from a ceremonial perspective that we might not still have that sort of thing, but from an administration of local government perspective, from a managing of the economy perspective, we should just be careful what we're arguing about around that. And those fuzzy concepts, I think, are a challenge. I think the other one is around service delivery, and you hear, concerns, legitimate concerns, have to stress, as was the case with the other ones as well, that by having these bigger geographies, actually service delivery is removed from the level that people currently live from a community perspective, and actually there's a bit of a challenge there from that. I think again, that's questionable. We have seen some of these things happen already, unitarisation in places like Northumberland, Devon, Cornwall, etc. And it doesn't seem like, although I'm sure there'll be lived experience that might say differently, but it doesn't seem like that's caused a massive issue in terms of that delivery. And so this idea then that we have to create hyper-local government, which is argued sometimes, I think we need to be careful about that, because simplicity is something we should be thinking about here, as well as matching boundaries. Do we really want to create another layer of government in there? Just need to be careful about that. One final thing to say around that, just while we're on levels of government, is that there are some people who argue, understandably, that as well as having, this simplified map, which might not look exactly like ours, but might look something like that, that we need that change. But also then, whether it means we need to have regional or pan-regional bodies over the top of that as well. Now, the government doesn't seem to be in that position, having seen the budget document where actually they're going to pull funding from these pan-regional, regional bodies. But I think there's a broader issue here as well about this desire to just create structures for the sake of creating structures as well. What is the purpose of that pan-regional, regional body? Now, there may be some issues where, like energy, some people have argued to me that having that higher body might make sense. But there are other issues, and let's pick transport, for example, where I think we do need to be a bit careful. The idea that we've got, the way we conceive or perceive the world, is that you have a combined authority which can deal with transport at that city region level that people use on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. You then have the Department for Transport, which deals with links between places. If we're saying we have to have this pan-regional body to deal with transport, then what's the point of the Department for Transport? Now, maybe that's a valid question. Maybe that's what people think. What is the point of the Department for Transport? But we can't have it both ways. Yeah. If we're going to have a pan-regional body or regional body, then that means we should scrap DFT. Yep. Otherwise, DFT should be doing that job. Might not be doing that job currently, but that's the thing to deal with, rather than we just need to create more structures and more confusion.
And come in on this, and I suppose, Paul's laid out some of the challenges and criticisms that have been thrown at us already. I think we're also recognizing that in part of our response is thinking about what next and what further devolution is all about, really, and not just where we want to get to in the short run, but where we need to get to in the medium term, and therefore we need to set up local government in such a way that it can receive more power and responsibilities over time. So just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Andrew. And you can see in the budget, for me, the really key word is, essentially paraphrasing slightly, making local government simpler. Right, we currently have an extremely complicated system of local government in England. Yeah. It really struggles to absorb kind of devolution in its current state. I think there's a real risk with extending the deals-based model, extending combined authority model created for the big cities out to new areas, that local government is becoming even more complicated than it currently is, rather than simpler. I think just purely in terms of the benefits of a simple and consistent system of local government across England are that, one, you can start using local government as a basis for public service reform, like having bodies across the country, about 48 or so, each of which kind of roughly similar in size, each of which roughly covering a similar kind of population, roughly covering kind of a similar mix of affluent and poor areas. So many more decisions that are kind of micromanaged in Whitehall can be devolved down to a lower level, and we reasonably expect kind of an improvement in public services as a consequence of that. But alongside kind of that devolution of service delivery, I don't really see how you can fix the local funding crisis and advance devolution without having reform of the structure of local government. In that we currently have a very centralised model of funding in England. It's very, very sensitive to levels of deprivation across the country. if you want to improve the growth incentive for local government across the country and give places the ability to grow their tax base and keep the returns of that, if you're worried about protecting public services, you need to create authorities that have a mix of affluent and less affluent communities within them. Otherwise, you risk having a structure in which affluent neighbourhoods get to cut the taxes and have very low need for services, while poorer neighbourhoods increase taxes just to keep the lights on. Our proposal for local government reform is structured to avoid that possibility and provide a future basis for government to really tackle the local finance problem that I think everybody who's watching this clip should understand is a really big priority for the sector.
So local government has clearly got a big financial problem. We can solve that in the short term with more money, but in the long term, that's going to requires fiscal devolution in order for that to happen.
Yes.
But if fiscal devolution is going to work, the geography is really, really important.
Absolutely.
It's just not, it just doesn't stack up unless you have that mix of affluent and less affluent places of production and then places of residence of those people commuting into the centres of those areas.
Yeah, and I think it also addresses, I mean, in some respects, it's a bit more of a philosophical question, which is actually what is the role, what is local government for, right? I mean, and that can be a philosophical discussion. It can be a very kind of central natured discussion about what it is that we want central government to be and the role that we want it to play. And that's not just relevant for us, that are interested in this space. That's a very relevant, pressing consideration for central government as well. And I think, trying to think about what we want local government to be and the role that we want it to play, and then thinking about funding mechanisms and structures, etc., that enable it to play those kinds of roles can feel so philosophical, but are really quite important, not least given where we are now with their funding base.
Yeah, I think as well as particularly in a constitutional system like ours, in which Parliament is sovereign, it can do what it likes. Local government doesn't have any sovereignty, it doesn't have any constitutional protections. We actually therefore need a really robust system of local government geography and finance to be able to efficiently and effectively say no to central government if it does change its mind in future and tries to centralise.
Right, okay. So let's take a couple of questions. We'll come back and fill out some of the details. Somebody anonymous said, pan-regional transport bodies already exist with established roles and remits to support partners, etc., and complement the role of the DFT. So you provided an extra bit of information on that. Which is,
well, they exist for now. The budget document suggests that might change. Well, let's see what that looks like.
That may well be true. And pick this one up. So this is from Glenn Athy, very much a friend of the centre. Said, I like the map. Well done, Glenn. Good work. Do you think this will help accelerate policy and stop people from pondering boundaries for years? And do you think that other boundaries, health trusts, police, etc., there should be a degree of co-terminosity that over time that we begin to think about all of these things beginning to align, which is obviously a public services reform question. Just reflections on that. Does it fast forward or quicken the policy debate, stops us pondering, and also co-terminosity, the importance of it?
Yeah, great questions. I'd like to hope that it speeds things up a bit. I mean, we have been discussing kind of devolution for a long time now. It does seem that the government, to their credit, they're moving quickly on getting a white paper done and moving forward on this question compared to the previous government, who took maybe 5 years or so to even begin pondering these questions. So hopefully it does kind of, fast forward the debate, at least providing a framework that we can debate and criticise and discuss. I think the second point is really key. Sometimes you see people in this space, maybe who aren't that close to local government, say, oh, these devolution structures won't work because they don't align with police force areas or the ICS, the NHS boundaries or some other boundary. Actually, I think the real solution to all of these problems is we need to fix local government first and then fix all of those other boundaries around the structure of local government. Because local government is the only kind of territorial unit which is by design democratically accountable to the people in that place. Right? If we're going to have any kind of system in which people pay taxes or they vote for somebody to change services in their area, those services have to be aligned around those local democratic structures. And
that reinforces the point about being very clear about what you want the role of local government to be and the position that local government should play, in the country in terms of delivery of services and democratic accountability, etc. Or did you want to? No. So I think so. That's answer to Glenn. So the next one from Ian Ray. So I think touches on a little bit something you said, Paul, was how would your proposed structures relate to emerging pressures for national planning, for example, on energy networks and or rail via Great British Railways. So there's a kind of, how do we think about the national and the local or the subnational?
Well, the principal position should be, what is the best geography to think about these things? So we shouldn't be devolving just for the sake of devolution. We should be talking about what is the right geographic level to hold some of these powers. Now, to the hyperlocal point, if it's the case that a reformed county unitary authority wants to split up its territory and deliver services in a slightly different way across that, or wants to do something around parish councils, it can do that. I mean, there'll be a funding challenge around that, but it could do that. But if it feels that that's the right geography, and that's something to be done. But I think though it's important to think about what is the best geography, because it does feel like, this is sort of perception and how I receive at least, that we are very attached to structures, and we just talk about the requirement for a new structure and create statutory bodies and all these sorts of things without really tackling the thorny questions, which are what's the right shape of local government, which is a really hard bit. So we jump to then talking about these pan-regional bodies. I'm sort of relaxed about having pan-regional bodies as long as we have a good rationale for it. I think the key test will be much of this stuff, I think, can be dealt with at a combined authority level. It is about trying to match powers to the geography that people live and work their lives over.
Yeah.
And quite a lot of things fall into that. Yeah. There then clearly will be some coordination challenges around transport or around energy, for example, which the combined authorities can't do on their own, because it is at something that operates at a geography which is at a higher level than them. The key question then is that a central government responsibility, or is there a requirement for a pan-regional body to be doing something slightly different? And I just think we need to have a conversation about what that looks like, rather than just assuming that what we need is pan-regional bodies.
Yeah. And the final thing I'd add to that is, if you really are just convinced that pan-regional partnerships are the correct solution to whichever issue you're thinking about, it'd be much easier to create a pan-regional partnership with our map than it would be with the current map.
Yeah.
That's a good point. And so is your discussion around changing their roles? Not sure which roles this question refers to. Are you questioning their existence in the first place? So just to repeat and to reiterate, just go through it again in terms of MCAs in our big urban areas, as we've got already. Elsewhere, we have essentially unitaries where districts no longer exist.
Right. Yes. So that's what we envisage. We envisage the metro mayors having control over the kind of economic and strategic powers, things like planning, transport, housing, and similar, whereas the boroughs underneath them would still continue doing many of the personal and social services they deliver currently, whereas the unitary county councils out in the shires would deliver both of those services, both economic services and also the personal services as well. I think in terms of the role of local government kind of as a system, I think what we are implying is, or I think we're saying explicitly, is that local government does need to care more about local economies than it currently does. If you look across the history of English local government, you can see it's always been very focused on this question of delivering services, particularly to the most vulnerable and unfortunate within our society, and it's appropriate and it should continue to do that. But one reason why the kind of current mess we currently are, not just from a local government perspective, but from a regional equality perspective and a national economic performance perspective, is because local government has never really been that invested in these questions of changing the local economy, of managing the local economy, of growing the local tax base. And actually, part of how we solve those social services points is we allow local government for the first time in many years to fund services by growing their local tax base.
Yeah, and that relates. So let's pick up this question from Kamal Panchal. Hello, Kamal. Good to hear from you. So he's a bit concerned about the industrial strategy, and basically saying, within the industrial strategy as it is, the green paper, it's relatively clear what's expected of the MCAs, in a sense what their role is. They're referenced on many occasions, less clear about everywhere else. And his point is growth sectors are everywhere. They're not just in the MCAs, et cetera, et cetera. So what does that mean for the rest of the country? So, I mean, that just talks to the point that you've just made, right? So we've got clarity on MCAs. We have them. Yeah. They're primarily, not exclusively focused on the economy related questions and issues in their areas, and the boroughs do other things. Outside, it's much less clear. But Paul, just pick up a little bit on that, because we've done some work on the industrial strategy and continue to do something on that, but how these things connect.
Yeah, well, there's definitely, I think, a a question about what, from a local growth plan perspective, what will happen to places that don't have mayors currently. But I think there's a broader question about how relevant is the industrial strategy to different parts of the country. Because as Kamal said, yes, some of these key sectors are outside of the MCAs, but actually quite a lot of them are inside. We do see a clustering of this activity within urban areas, and our colleague James wrote a blog on this just last week to show that actually there's a very varied geography in terms of where these things tend to go. And this gets us into our questions about, should we focus on widening of devolution or deepening of devolution? But hold that for a second. I think we should have a conversation about that. I guess the question is whether, so would having a local growth plan for a place like Cornwall sort of have a benefit to a place like Cornwall, and then would have a benefit to the national economy as a whole? And I think that is a question to be had from a national economy perspective, because Cornwall makes up such a small part of the national economy. It probably will make a fairly marginal difference to the performance of the national economy. But I can see a merit for having a local growth plan for Cornwall to make Cornwall the best possible version of itself.
Yep.
The issue for Cornwall, though, or issue for national and local policymakers, is that the best possible version of Cornwall is not as strong as the best possible version of Greater Manchester. And so we need any local growth plan that is created needs to be created within that context. Whether there is a reformed local government in place to deliver that or not, whether we need to have another body to create that plan or not. I think that's secondary to that primary question about what it is that we think we can achieve and what it is that the state can do in those different parts of the country. That then brings us, I think, to the broader question about widening or deepening. So certainly before the budget, there was a sense that the devolution project was about filling in the map. It was about trying to widen devolution and get everywhere to have representation, which I think there is a lot of merit in trying to do that from a democratic perspective. But if I come at this from an economy perspective, there is a challenge and there's a trade-off here, in that widening devolution will create a lot of, or take up a lot of civil service bandwidth in order to do that. And the question is, how much return on from the economy perspective will you actually get to these places that are much smaller, vis-a-vis, going deeper in some of the places that have got devolution already. Now, in an ideal world, yes, you would want this to happen everywhere. But in the world of trade-offs, actually from an industrial strategy perspective, from a national economy perspective, giving, making good on the single settlement commitments in Greater Manchester, West Midlands, and other places, I think would have a bigger economic impact than trying to colour in the map and make sure that everywhere has got some degree of devolution.
Yeah, let's keep, because we've had a couple more questions. Let's keep pushing on to put there, because not least they're asking for points of clarification. And so, question about how long would this take? Now, how long is a piece of string?
Yep.
Depending on the approach that you take, i.e., government, will often determine how long it takes. We're advocating for government to be much more involved in reforming local government than it has thus far, where the deal-based approach has very much been the dominant form. So if government was more involved, let's think about what happened in Scotland. Let's think about what happened in Wales, what's happened in Northern Ireland. What are we thinking about in terms of timeframes? How soon could we see our map come into existence?
Yeah, definitely. So I think if you look back at those past examples and also the forms we had in the early 1970s, basically it took about 2 years to sort of get it through Parliament and then sort of agreed and enforced. Another 2 years to then actually get everything physically changed on the ground. So I think, a rapid approach, you're looking at about 4 years.
Yeah.
It does seem the government is there were perhaps some inclinations that it might instead prefer to do reorganisation incrementally, kind of sort of picking up the pace, but still not doing it in one big bang, but drawing it out over a longer period, which would obviously take longer. There's also the further benefits we've been discussing around kind of public service reform, fiscal devolution. That's going to take more than 4 years, even in our kind of rapid scenario, because we need the base first before we can start discussing those questions. Yeah,
and I think the degree, I think the key variable in the length of time it takes is the willingness for government to essentially drive through or push through a process, often in with some understandable local resistance, which picks up on Kevin Johnson's point. Paul, you can come in on this. So he's basically saying it's been slow. It partly results because turkeys don't vote for Christmas, councillors, etc. How would you kind of deal with this issue where we've kind of partly answered that in the sense that, the
Yeah.
deal-based approach has had virtues and value, but we've run out, we've run out to the end of the road on that, right?
Yes. Well, one of the pushbacks you can get well, let's rephrase that. In order for this to work, it's going to require central government, I think, to draw the boundaries of this map, and we would advise to do it on the way that Anthony's presented in the map that was shown on the screen. The reason for that is because it's understandable that there will be local political coalitions that might be pulled together. That we've got good relationships with you on a political level, which means that we think it makes sense locally. And when you've only got the view of sort of the local level, you can understand why you might go down that route. The issue with this, though, is going back to the economy points, is that for all of this to stack up, require an actor in this that sees how the architect of the whole system and understand how the whole system would stack up, rather than just what would seemingly make sense to you under slightly different constraints in your area. And so there has to be a role for central government in this. Cannot absolve itself from it. And in a way, we sort of got to that position with the local enterprise partnerships, where it was the coalitions of the willing, and the government said, let 1,000 flowers bloom and you do what you want. And we've ended up with a hodgepodge of geographies that now no longer exist because they're pulling funding finally for the local enterprise partnerships. And actually, ironically, even within that, the government did have to get involved, at least in the northeast, to change the geography. So even then, when they said they wanted to take a step back, they did step in, but only partly did that. So that is something that the government will have to do. Now, some people will say, "Oh, this is not devolution to basically impose upon us this geography." But the geography has to make sense, and otherwise the whole thing doesn't work. And we go through a whole load of pain in order to not get the outcomes that we want to achieve, which just seems like a waste of time, basically. You might as well stick with the current system.
I mean, it's the paradox of the current situation, right? Which is that central government sometimes believes itself responsible for services delivered at the most micro level, like chess tables and Hull and similar. But it sort of is really reluctant to view itself as responsible for the entire system as a whole, which is the only thing that central government can be responsible for, right? I think this is kind of a little bit to Kamal's question earlier. I think a really big risk about some of the stuff we've heard about the English Devolution white paper is an imperative to get local growth plans agreed everywhere, and a belief that kind of combined authorities are sort of doing economic activities creates this impulse to spread combined authorities everywhere, which we think would be a really, really big mistake. 2 reasons. One is that the combined authorities were created as a structure by and for the big cities to solve a big city problem, which is lots of little unitaries next to each other, all taking part in a shared economy, not bits of a combined county council of a county council of varying different shapes and sizes. But also, second, because the current structure of local government we have now is so messy and varied, if you take combined authorities everywhere, you risk getting very inconsistent geographies when you move up a tier. So you'll end up with some places you'll have perhaps like a triple tier devolution structure. In some places, it might be a single county plus unitary donut structure. In other places, it would be mega monster double county structure, simply because how combined authorities are created and work. And all of that kind of cuts against what the budget said, which is that local government has to be simpler.
Yeah. Just on Kevin's point as well about Turks at Christmas, I think there has been examples of that in some of the trade press in the last week or so. But the counter to that is the leader of Basildon's article, which I think was common pieces in the LGC. If you haven't read that, definitely go and have a read of it, where he actually makes the compelling points along the lines that we do, which is, he says, in order to deliver for the people of his area, he thinks there does need to be local government reform along a broader geography, which is very refreshing and interesting to read.
And not to overemphasize this point, I mean, I think it's quite clearly, it's obvious that, in a sense, waiting for the local government sector, broadly defined, to come to some consensus on this, we will be waiting a very, very long time. That's not a criticism of the local government industry or sector. It's just it's made up of very, very different organisations with, in many respects, polar opposite views and agendas. And that's fine. It is what it is. But in the sense, you aren't going to get, or be very unlikely to get, a local government coherent response, which requires then central government to essentially step in and perform that role in the absence of consensus. Yeah, I agree with you, which is interesting in the sense. So Ian Ray, second question. Thank you, Ian. So if you kept existing county boundaries, you could move planning powers to them in maybe 12 months. They already have some economic development and transport. And come in on it's partly why, in a sense, as you've said, if you look at the map, many of it is actually existing counties, right?
Yes,
In some
precisely.
respects.
So yeah,
So we're with you on most of the way, Ian.
Exactly. So of our 48 authorities, our kind of metro mayor and county authorities that we propose, 21 are either the existing county council, so that'd be Buckinghamshire or Norfolk, which is two-tier, or it's a really obvious reform that you would make, right? So you might merge the two Cumbria authorities back into a unitary Cumbria, or Leicestershire and Leicester. I think that's part of our pragmatic principle, is trying to think about going with the grain of both existing institutions, but also identities, when we do have to make a choice between sort of getting the finer details of alignment of economic geographies with new institutions. But this comes back again to sort of this problem about the combined authorities, right? Which is that a proposal like ours, on the face of it, quite radical, but when you compare it to the alternatives of creating combined authorities everywhere and creating very complicated structures, ours is actually more pragmatic, right? We're actually saying to places like Norfolk and Buckinghamshire, you should have all the powers of a local authority and a combined authority. You don't really need to change much about your institution. You can just get cracking with thinking about transport and planning and all these other things that are, your area needs to happen.
There are within that, of course, some thorny questions which we shouldn't shy away from. I think mentioned Hampshire already. Clearly an issue there where maybe the path of least resistance on this will be to create a Hampshire body, authority, or whatever it is, which is based on historic identities, which understand why people might want to do that. But there is a challenge that the north of Hampshire is Basingstoke, Aldershot, etc., which point very much north and probably got more in common with Reading and Berkshire than they have with Portsmouth and Southampton. And then try and create a body where a mayor or a leader of another name has to try and implement economic policy over those very different geographies is basically setting up to fail. So yes, the path of least resistance in the short term, but actually it does really make somebody's life much more difficult, I think, in the longer term, and probably doesn't then deliver for the residents of those areas by having that body. But clearly, there are all sorts of small p politics wrapped up in that, which definitely means that this is not the easiest route forward in terms of what we're proposing.
Yeah, and we're fully appreciative of that. I think, as I said at the beginning, the virtue and the value of the map is in a sense that it focuses debate and discussion away from abstract and fuzzy and in principle to actually making some decisions. And we are in the decision-making element now. I think the idea of more debate going round and round is past. We need to make some decisions, not least, which is a good thing. The white paper, not least, will force us into some of those decisions, and there will be trade-offs associated with the decisions that are made. Just a couple of questions. Can we access or send the map? If you go onto our website, centrecities.org, and look under devolution, you will definitely see the map in several places. You can get a full eye on the map and all the detail and some of the fine grained stuff, and more description about both the principles that inform the map, but also then the places that actually make up the proposals that we've done. But it's gone 1:30, and I said we would finish at 1:30. I hope that's been useful. Thank you to Paul, and the debate will continue on. The white paper gives us a chance to really flesh some of these out. If we've got things wrong, or we've missed things, or we've underemphasized things, please do get in touch and let us know.